questions and answers, right? So as to allow for our audience to have some time to relax before they leave. Okay. I would please like to request that we just stand to our feet to welcome the Deputy Minister of Home Affairs as she comes to give her speech to us. Please, can we rise to just welcome, as we clap our hands to welcome the Honourable Minister, Deputy Minister.
Good evening, everybody. Firstly, let me extend formally the apologies of Minister Gikaba. His mother has taken ill and was hospitalized this afternoon. Hence, you have me in his stead. And given that I've had all of 4 hours sleep last night and was up at 5 o'clock, Steve, you have a very unskilled migrant here. Secondly, let me thank all of the participants who participated here today, because I do think that the issue of migration and immigration in particular has for too long been left to the Department of Home Affairs alone. I don't have a prepared lecture, but I want to pose a few propositions, and then I thought I would take the opportunity to speak about some of the new regulations and some of our initiatives and why we've done certain things. But let me begin by talking about immigration policy. Immigration policy in any state is not a standalone policy. It's there to support the country's national interests. It's there to support your development goals, essentially. And interestingly, South Africa last had a review on its immigration policy 15 years ago. Even though our goals have changed, our national interests have changed, our policy remains static. And a lot of that was defined by what one of the speakers spoke about, an open door policy that we embraced early on in 1994 when we were in love with the world and the world was in love with us. Globalization was still a very romanticized concept, and 9/11 had not happened yet. So all of those things informed our policy. 15 years later, I think we are the only country in the world with our economic profile that has not taken any initiative to review its immigration laws. Propositions. Immigration holds many advantages, but it also holds potential disadvantages. What are these advantages? Of course, economic. People would know various countries would make it easy for teachers, for example, to get visas, long-term visas in countries where teachers were required. Where investment is required, usually government comes to the party by handing out freely available visas to those who can show deep pockets. What we have done certainly is no different. I've just come back from Gauteng, where today we have inaugurated our one-stop center aimed at big business, those clients who require many visas because they import some skills, but who also employ significant numbers of South Africans. So your big corporations like car manufacturers, your Mercedes-Benz, your BMWs, your big petroleum companies, all of these are foreign direct investors into our economy. And we are competing for their business. with several other countries and oftentimes very developed countries. And so very much part and parcel of our strategy with the new regulations has been to leverage on some of our immigration rules to advance our economic interests. And what are the disadvantages? Well, illicit goods, health and security risks in a society and in a world in which we live in currently. There are significant threats to peace and stability. We have seen this on the African continent, and we have seen it in particular in Kenya. This is not to say that these cannot be mitigated, and I'll come back to that later on. Securing the border is very, very important. Again, we have to look to our past. Prior to 1994, we had a very secure border, but we also had conscription, and we had the army at the border and acting beyond our borders, in fact, extending our borders out to our neighboring states. We then had various paramilitary stroke security instruments at our disposal, particularly your commando system, which operated very effectively along the border area. And this was, in effect, our border management. In 1994, we stopped conscription, and we now have a much leaner defense force. The commando system is dismantled, and all of the paramilitary and security instruments that we had deployed at the border areas dissipated. And as I said, we opened our arms to the world, and we were very welcoming. We signed very early in our democracy various conventions, including the Refugee Convention. We still have, as South Africa, one of the most liberal refugee regimes. And we do attract, Premier, quite a lot of asylum seekers, many of whom are indeed unskilled laborers or low-skilled laborers who come using the asylum system to regularize their stay, as opposed to being genuine refugees. The actual population of refugees in the country is relatively small. And so what has happened is, clearly as a country, we do not necessarily, it's not in our interest to add to our low-skilled base. We have that in South Africa. We have huge numbers of young people unemployed. And so clearly our immigration policy never looked at providing easy access into South Africa for low-skilled workers. And these then obviously started utilizing the asylum route to legalize their stay. I think the other thing that we often forget about is that actually it's South Africans employing these people. I think there's a very, very important area of discussion that we have to have around the work ethic of South Africans, and particularly young people. Migrants, by their very nature, are enormously industrious. They come prepared to work hard and to really make their lives a success. And this is true of any migrant. Doesn't matter whether you're skilled or unskilled. You have a work ethic second to none. And clearly, as in many other countries, migrants then pose direct competition for scarce jobs in South Africa. And that has happened. When we talk about asylum seekers who are unskilled workers coming into our country, make no mistake, a lot of that happens illicitly across our borders. And while the Defense Force has been deployed for about 2 years now back at the border, certainly in terms of capacity, there's a huge constraint there. But the plan is to establish a border management agency which will be responsible for both manning and operating the ports of entry, but very importantly, securing the borderline area. So those are part of the plans to deal with our border issues in particular. But we can't do this alone. And one of the things that people have to understand is that without bilateral cooperation with our neighboring countries, there's no amount of resources that you can plow into securing your borderline. And the example of the U.S. is very apt in this regard. The U.S. has spared no resources to patrol, to basically barricade its border with Mexico. But last year, the U.S. recorded an all-time high of illegal migrants from Mexico into the U.S. And I think that this is a lesson that we all have to be aware of, that securing a border is a dual function. It's the function of the sending country as well as the receiving country. And if you look at Europe, the Europeans have got a visa-free regime for European citizens through the Schengen situation. And the question is often asked of Africa in particular and Southern Africa in particular, why it is that this has not worked terribly well. And again, it's about cooperation between states. It's about being able to share data. It's about primarily the registration of our citizens. If we don't know who our citizens are, we certainly cannot cooperate with another country that requires that kind of data. So all of those things have to be in place. And countries must be able to share that information in order to build a degree of trust and cooperation to allow for freedom of movement. Having said that, there is enormous progress, though. There are several initiatives underway, and no doubt soon certain announcements will have to be made. Immigration is everyone's business is the next proposition I want to make. For too long, I think, in South Africa, we have this notion that the Department of Home Affairs is responsible for immigration, but actually, in those countries that best manage immigration, you find ordinary citizens engaging with immigration implementation. What do I mean by that? When we addressed in Sandton a few weeks ago the business community, many people came to me and said, we hired X amount of people and they've now left and we want visas to be renewed for our company. And my question was, so where did these people who left go to? Well, we don't know, somewhere. Well, in well-managed countries, when a company supports an application for one of its workers to come from abroad, that company equally bears the responsibility of informing the authorities when the person is either fired or leaves work and goes elsewhere. South Africa, that doesn't happen. We don't seem to have that culture. Likewise in hotels, where tourists don't pitch up for their reservations. In those countries that manage immigration well, there's an immediate contact made with the authorities to say, I expected Mr. X and Mrs. Y who had booked room X and Y, but they have not turned up. It is just simply impossible for a government department who employs 10,000 people to do both citizen work as well as immigration work to run an immigration system by themselves. No matter what kind of systems you have in place and no matter what the technology is that you employ in this regard. So we have to certainly develop a culture that allows us to assume that kind of responsibility as part of our civic obligations rather than anything else. In South Africa, people think nothing of employing illegal migrants. But just think about it. The very term illegal migrants speaks to the rule of law. And we have all, I don't think we find anybody who will say that there's certain aspects of our Constitution that we disagree with. And our Constitution enjoins us to fundamentally uphold the rule of law, no matter what that is. It doesn't matter if it's a traffic fine or if it's how you protest when you do express your right to dissent. If you do so, and by expressing your dissent, whether it's service delivery, protests, etc., but at the same time you go and you burn a clinic or you damage a school, well, which parts of the Constitution are you now upholding? So I think we have a very odd situation in our country. We have very extreme views. Some people seem to suggest that we want absolutely nothing to do with foreign nationals in our country and they must go home. And then on the other extreme is open the doors, let everybody in. And what is this thing, these colonial boundaries that we have and so on? It's absolutely a fact. And what it is really us being able to find that balance in that pendulum from the one extreme or the other extreme, somewhere down the middle, and for us to act responsibly. The other interesting thing around making immigration everybody's business, and this is what we do intend to do as we change our immigration policy and as we introduce early next year a green paper on immigration, we aim to engage people like you. We aim to engage the ordinary housewife. We aim to engage students because we think that South Africans have simply not engaged the issue very much, and that it is absolutely vital that we start seeing ourselves as potential migrants. South African communities, particularly the black communities, have been very insular. You know, in some sectors of South African society, kids, after they've finished their matric, take a gap year and they travel. And then they come back or they study overseas or something of that nature. It doesn't seem to happen in many of our communities because we don't see ourselves as potential migrants. Because if we did, well, then the whole world opens up to us, and then suddenly, you know, the shoe is on the other foot. When we are in those countries, how do we expect to be treated? So I do think that this discussion is going to be a very exciting national discussion. And it's really, really very timely, Steve, that you've had this initiative. And I do hope that it does continue into the future and that it does contribute significantly to our process of reviewing our policy. Xenophobia. I agree with many things, in fact most things that Fani said. It was as if he read my speech in Parliament the other day, and I said very categorically that I don't think we must use xenophobia as a euphemism, because I think sometimes it tends to be used in that way. It reminds me, just being here on this stage, that when I was in Standard 8 in those days, we still had standards, so I'm very old. I had for all of 6 months a wonderful, wonderful teacher. I went to a public school. I had an apartheid education, but I had a wonderful teacher by the name of Dr. Muthal Naidu. And she is a playwright, and was recently awarded also one of the national orders, to my absolute delight. But she so impressed me in those 6 months. The one day she came into the class and she wrote this strange word with an X on the board. And she turned to the class and she said, "Who knows what this means?" And I was a bit of a nerd, and I used to learn a word from the dictionary every night before I slept, which is kind of an odd thing to do for a child. I was very disturbed, clearly. And in the dictionary, it said an intense fear of foreigners. And I, of course, very enthusiastically put up my hand and I said, "I know what it means, I know what it means." And she said, "Well, what does it mean?" So I said, "An intense fear of foreigners." And she said, "No." I was devastated. And she said, "No, it's a hatred of anything that is different from you." And so it is racism. And I don't think that we should shy away from calling it racism, because I don't know how I can differentiate, frankly, by just looking at a person as to whether they are South African or non-South African. The only thing I know is they're different from me. I don't know how you differentiate somebody who comes from Zimbabwe and somebody who comes from the Limpopo province. I don't know how you differentiate a Bangladeshi or a South African Indian. So we must call it what it is. It is sheer and utter racism. And I quite agree. We are an angry society. I think we are also a very insular society. And we've been so for many, many years. And that we regard anything different from ourselves, including other South Africans, as problems. And I agree that social cohesion and perhaps even dispute resolution, community-based dispute resolution mechanisms need to be. We used to have those peace initiatives and so on in our communities, yes. So what are we doing? Finally, I just want to talk about the migrant awards. I spare no effort at saying to people that we have a very unique constitution. Actually, it's quite unique in the world. Every right has got a limitation. But unlike other constitutions in the world that profess a certain degree of nationalism, national pride, ours enjoins us to celebrate diversity. And this is a very, very profound notion. And I don't know if any country and any community has ever got it right. But it's a proposition and a challenge that was posed to us by our leaders. And if we are truly the children of a Nelson Mandela, an Oliver Tambo, a Walter Sisulu, we need to rise to that challenge. It really doesn't help to say that South Africa is no different from other countries, because xenophobia is everywhere. We see it in Europe, we see it in Asia, we've seen it with the Rohingyas in Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia. But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, we aim to be different. And it's in that striving that I think we will come close to what our founding fathers and mothers had intended. That in our difference, we seek the humanity. And this is really what the Migrant Awards are aimed at highlighting. It's aimed at highlighting the amazing achievements of some of our migrants who have come into the country and their contributions, and the wonderful work and the wonderful asset that they have been to our nation. But it's also about communities who have integrated. There's a category there that says that will go to a community that have best integrated with their foreign counterparts. And the award for that is an amazing award. What it is that that community will then get a legacy project built in that community, whether it's a school, whether it's a community hall, etc., etc. We are also going to be having a category for a South African who has made a contribution in another country and thereby elevated our status as well, so as to showcase the fact that South Africans are actually also migrants. So these are wonderful awards, and they're happening next week on Monday evening. And I do hope that you'll all tune into the television and so on and get your friends and family to, because I think the issue is about the message that will send, the issue of social cohesion, the issue of celebrating our diversity, etc. Finally, let me just address some of the new regulations, and I might fall asleep at this point because I'm quite bored about speaking about them. Let me just say that South Africa has had a very liberal visa system, and that it was significantly abused, posing huge risks to our peace and prosperity. If we have introduced certain requirements of our visitors, it is particularly informed by our desire to maintain a secure country. If your country is insecure, you have no reason to hope that your tourism industry and sector or any other economic sector will prosper. Kenya is a case in point. I had gone to Kenya at the time of the Westgate attacks precisely to discuss with my Kenyan counterpart, the porous nature of their borders and how some of the movement was affecting our own security in South Africa. When I landed there, the Westgate attacks took place. Now, if you know anything about the tourism sector in Kenya, it is a well-renowned, I think it was probably one of the most established tourism sectors on the continent, attracting people from Europe, the Americas, and basically most first world countries. If you go to Kenya today, you will see first-class resorts standing empty. It is a balancing act, and we have to act in the best interests of our country and the Commonwealth as a whole. It may require some effort for people to go into our embassies to take their biometrics, but we are also trying to address some of these hardships as we engage with various sectors, including the tourist sector. We have been told by them that India and China are particularly problematic. We have opened up 9 visa facilitation centers throughout India so that people don't have to travel great distances from their home should they wish to visit South Africa, and are able to then submit their biometrics closer to home. We are likewise engaging with the Chinese government, and at this stage we have an additional 2 visa facilitation centers that have recently been opened in China to address particularly this hardship. But remember, not everybody needs a visa to come to South Africa. We have several countries that are visa exempt, and they don't then need to go and take their biometrics. But we will, in addition, be having and rolling out through our modernization program biometrics at our ports of entry. We do not envisage, though, that the requirement for those who need visas to submit their biometrics at our embassies or the visa facilitation centers will be eradicated by our introduction of biometrics at the ports of entry. Our experience has shown us that it's important not only to verify who's applying for a visa, but also to make sure that the very same person arrives at your port of entry, as opposed to somebody else. So before I start giving away big national secrets, let me move on to children. We have a particular problem in South Africa that perhaps is not seen anywhere else. Geographically speaking, we are located in the southern tip of a continent that is laboring under huge poverty in some areas. We have first-hand experience as Home Affairs of children being transported over our borders by taxis through our ports of entry and just being dumped in South Africa. And when I say children, I mean as young as 6 and 7 years old. We also have several instances of children being kidnapped out of South Africa, some even by their own parents, where there is a divorce and one of the parents is a foreign national. That parent, despite a court order, would take their child overseas, and the mother usually never sees the child again. Home Affairs is responsible because we facilitated the travel out of the country. Child trafficking is big business, which is not to say that those children are necessarily ending up in South Africa, but South Africa is a transit route. Accordingly, and of course there are other considerations. You would have seen recently a Cape Town teenager being, or wanting to travel to join ISIS. The parents were none the wiser. Had it not been for the information that then came to fore, the parents would not have known that their child had traveled to wherever she was going to travel to. But what was more important for us, I guess, as a country, is that this child would have easily been able to return after having acquired certain military and other kinds of nefarious training. And goodness knows the untold damage that would have been done had that child been deployed to do whatever they do back home. For these and other reasons, let me just say, we require simply the consent of parents when children are traveling through our ports of entry, whether they are foreign nationals or whether they are South Africans. However, if a foreign child requires a visa, then the consent of the parents will be given at our embassy or at the point of the application process, and does not necessarily need to be given in writing at the port of entry for entrance or exit. So that's basically the only difference. But ultimately, the principle is that parents must consent to their child either traveling into the country or traveling out of the country. And it's just that simple. What we've done is we have put on our website a very simplified version of the kinds of documents that will be required. You can't say that you want the consent of the parents without having a document to prove who the parents are. So the unabridged birth certificate is in fact that document. It contains the details of the child and the child's parents. There are difficulties with some children in regard to obtaining unabridged birth certificates from Home Affairs, simply because those documents were produced at a time when Home Affairs did not digitize the unabridged birth certificates, and they were done manually. Under those circumstances, you will go to our office, apply for the unabridged birth certificate. If it is not produced, we will give you written confirmation based on our National Population Register data, which links you to your child and your spouse or girlfriend or whoever to your child as well. So we'll be able to give you documentation to confirm the parentage of your child in lieu of a birth certificate, should there be a problem for the next 12 months. Yeah, so those are essentially what we now require in terms of the new regulations, and I do want to thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Honourable Deputy Minister. Yes, we just want to actually proceed, but then we need to take the group photographs. But I think before we do that, I am aware that these guys are still organizing themselves. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because I'm aware that immediately after the photograph, we have some of our guest speakers will be leaving. Yeah, so I don't know if I can take one or two questions. So while they are busy trying to organize themselves, but now while they are doing that, there's someone in the audience, which of course I think for me it's good to actually recognize, who has been there all along to make sure that this event actually works out, and it's actually my person. I don't know if Mr. Roland is in the audience. Mr. Roland, please, can you stand up? Please, thank you very much. So, Mr. Roland is actually the vice president of the organization. He has been there all along. So we want to take the photograph now. Can we have the leaders of these organizations on board? Roland, please, can you assist to bring them forward? Okay. We actually have a list.
Can we, yes. Okay. Can we be snappy because we do have a time constraint being in the auditorium, please? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. So please, we want to go right away to the questions and answer. And the Honourable Minister is still very much with us. I just want us to just be very quick with the questions. And there are roving mics moving around to, wherever you are seated, the roving mic will be there.